introduce our first speaker. So let's give them a hand. And our first speaker this morning is somebody who'll need no introduction to most of you, Uriah Kriegel from philosophy at Sydney University and Arizona, who's going to be speaking to us on the dispensability of intentional objects. Welcome, Uriah.
Thank you, Hugh, and thanks, Luca, for organizing the conference. What I want to talk about are three things. First, I'll try to zoom in from the topic of the conference to the topic of my talk. Then I'll present a positive position about the topic of my talk and then defend this position against three objections. So the topic of the conference is ontological commitment. And there are two kinds of questions I think you can ask with respect to ontological commitment. One is the first order question, which things should we be ontologically committed to? Or which putative entities should we accept as genuine entities, or genuinely accept as entities, or accept genuinely as entities? That's something like, what should we be ontologically committed to? Second order question is, what are we doing when we are ontologically committing to something? What is involved in being ontologically committed to something? What is it for us to be ontologically committed to something? And I think one way to think of it is that the first order question asks about the extension of exists or is, treated just for the sake of exposition as a predicate. And the second order question asks about the intention of exists or is. Or we might say that the first order question is the subject matter of ontology, and the second order question is the subject matter of meta-ontology. That will be a bit like ethics and meta-ethics. Ethics asks which things are good. Meta-ethics asks what is it for something to be good? What's involved in when we're saying that something is good, what is it that we're saying about it? And likewise, meta-ontology says what is it what we're saying about something when we're ontologically committing to it? Or we say that it exists or is. So the topic of the conference, I think, probably there will be talks about both kinds of questions. But when I hear ontological commitment, I think of a conference that's dedicated to the second order question. Considered what is ontological commitment? What is it to ontologically commit to something? That's a topic. But I'll be talking actually about the first order question. Particular issue with respect to whether some kinds of putative entities really do exist. My excuse for doing that is that the question I'll be asking, the particular issue that I'll be tackling, is the most general that you can have within that first order question. So what do I mean by the most general? Here are some putative entities that you have all kinds of ontological controversies around. Mathematical entities, moral properties, possibilia, time. This is not a comprehensive list. There will be a bunch of others. Of course, as we all know in philosophy, there's always, even for the most obvious entities that we should accept, there's someone who says, no, these are not real entities. So when I think what is most obvious to me that we should accept in our ontology, I think of people, cars, houses, trees, tables. But you have a lot of philosophers, or you have some philosophers at least, like Peter van Inwagen, will claim that cars and houses and tables don't really exist. Other philosophers will say that even trees or snails, if snails are unconscious, don't exist, like Trenton Merrickx holds this. Other people will claim that there are no macrophysical objects at all. Even people don't exist. You only have subatomic particles in the world. That's Gideon Rosen's view. And you could have some people who deny that even microphysical objects exist, that neither macrophysical nor microphysical objects exist. Some gunk theorists might hold this, and some monists, Terry Horgan, I think, is committed to saying that there are neither people nor subatomic particles. There's only one thing, really, the biggest thing. And so these are these are objects that have been denied, whose existence has been denied by some philosophers, but it's not mainstream to debate whether these things exist. They seem to, maybe it's more better thought of as a challenge to ontology, but most people accept that they exist. And notice that these are all concrete particulars. The putative entities that I mentioned as producing the biggest controversies are usually not concrete particulars. So these are entities that no philosopher, or very few philosophers, feel very certain that they either exist or don't exist. Mathematical entities, moral properties, possibilia, time. Well, maybe time is a concrete particular. I guess that's intelligible. But who knows what time is? Well, some people might know it. I shouldn't be punking time in a conference sponsored by the Center for Time. That's a sentence you've never heard before. So, what I want to add to this list is the category of intentional objects, construed as a category that includes also merely intentional objects. So an intentional object, for the purposes of our talk, can be defined as an object of thought. An intentional object is an object of thought. So I'm thinking about Vienna. Vienna is the object of my thought, so Vienna is an intentional object. But it's not merely an intentional object because it's also an object in some other senses. Merely intentional objects are things that are objects of thought but are not objects in any other sense. So Sherlock Holmes would be an example. You can think of Sherlock Holmes. But if Sherlock Holmes is an object, it's only in virtue of being an object of thought. Now, why do I say that this is the most general kind of question you can ask in this area? Because notice that mathematical entities, moral properties, possibilia, time, artifacts, all these are very different kinds of putative entities. But they all have one thing in common, at least, is that they're all things that we can contemplate. They're all contemplatables. Contemplatables? Contemplatables? Are there rules about this? So they are thinkables. They are things that you can think about. So they are intentional objects, perhaps merely intentional objects. But in fact, you might think that if something is not thinkable, it cannot even be subject to a controversy in ontology. So in a way, to get into the game of ontological commitment, you need to be a thinkable. You need to be an intentional object. Once you got into the game, maybe you'll win and you'll be on the list of the things that we should accept. Maybe you'll lose and you'll drop out. But to get into the game, you need to be an intentional object. An intentional object is what all these things have in common. So if you had an argument that you should accept merely intentional objects, you will have produced in one fell swoop an argument for all these controversial entities to accept them into your ontology. You may have to change a little bit your preconceptions on what kind of entity these entities are, but you will accept them as existing. So in that sense, the category of intentional objects is the highest ontological category. We might say it's the category that is not a subcategory of any other ontological category. We can sort of, I don't know if this is a definitional or it's a substantive claim about the category of intentional objects, but in any case, it's the category which is not a subcategory of any other ontological category. In that sense, it's the highest ontological category. Another way to think of it is to say that the predicate is an intentional object, cannot function as a sortal. It will not divide putative entities into two subgroups, those that are intentional objects and those that aren't. Because everything, to get into the game, like I said, you have to be an intentional object. We don't know what's on the other side of is an intentional, what drops outside is an intentional object. We cannot even contemplate it, and that's true here. So that's the first